Hey everyone, welcome to Crossing Borders with Nathan Lustig, where I interview entrepreneurs doing startups across borders and the people who support them, with a focus on companies that have some relationship to Latin America. My guest today is Santiago Zavala, a Mexican entrepreneur turned venture capitalist who now runs 500 Startups Mexico. Santiago is an amazing story. Originally from a smaller city outside of Mexico City, Santiago grew up in an entrepreneurial family that was in on the ground floor of the Latin American tech scene. He started programming and built his first business, a guitar forum with millions of users, when he was just 12 years old. During university, Santiago and a group of friends were the SWAT team that came in and rescued failing projects, many times for people much older than he was. After starting a startup at university and then working on a startup in Silicon Valley, he co-founded a network of hackathons across Latin America. Then, Santiago moved across the table and started Mexican VC to invest in Mexican seed stage companies. They later merged with 500 Startups, where Santiago and team have invested in 79 companies. Now on their third fund, they're continuing to push the Latin American ecosystem forward. Santiago has a unique perspective because he's been working with tech companies in the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Mexico for such a long time. I enjoyed my conversation with Santiago and hope you do too. Hello, Santiago. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being willing to do it. So where are you in the world today?
Right now I'm in Mexico City.
Nice. And what are you up to in Mexico City?
Well, right now we are planning for the release of the application process for the next batch. So I'm here at the office with the whole team this week. We are preparing a lot of content, and then next week we are announcing the application process for batch 8.
So batch 8. So how many batches per year do you do at 500 Mexico?
We try to do 2. This one, for example, we're going to start early November, I guess, so it kind of crosses the year. But we try to do 2 a year.
And how many companies generally participate in a batch?
Between 15 to 20.
And how do companies apply?
The process is very simple. I mean, they learn about what we're doing and they can review a lot of our offering on the website. And then once they're ready, we have a simple form that goes through AngelList. So they have to have their AngelList profile. And then we ask them to record a video where they tell us a little bit about their story. And then we spent a little bit of time in some questions just going through what they're trying to do, what they've accomplished so far, what they have learned with what they have accomplished, and then a little bit of the plans for the future. So it's a very simple application process. And then if we are excited about what they're doing, we'll reach out to learn more, either through a series of interviews or just asking for more information.
And how much money do you end up investing in a company that participates?
We invest $65,000 per company.
That's good. That's a solid amount of money for Latin America.
Yeah, I mean, we started doing $20,000 when we started in 2011, and we thought that was enough to have people working full-time for 6 months. And most entrepreneurs taught us that they spent less money than we expected. So instead of trying to just give them less money, we try to be able to bring more money so that they can spend more in online marketing and growing the team a little bit. So in a way, we merged 2 stages in one, if you will.
Oh, that makes sense. And so where are you from originally?
I'm originally from Cuernavaca, which is 1 hour from Mexico City.
And what's Cuernavaca like for people who don't know it? How many people? What's kind of the lifestyle?
It used to be like a smaller town. It's now a small city. It has it's around 1 million people. There's a lot of people from Mexico City that moved over there in the last 10 years to have a little bit of a quieter time. Mm-hmm. But now it's also very big, so it's not that quiet.
Did you move directly to Mexico City from there or go somewhere else in between?
My whole story, my father has always been doing technology companies, so I got to see a lot of the entrepreneurship from the household. And he did a couple of companies in Cuernavaca while I was very, very young. But then there was a moment where he wanted to grow his company, so he ended up moving to Mexico City and just spending the weekends with us in Cuernavaca. But then after a year or two, we ended up moving here when I was in middle school. But then I went back to Cuernavaca for college, at least for the first half of college. So I ended up living over there again. And then I came back to Mexico City, spent some time in the US, and then here again.
Interesting. And so what kind of business was your family involved with?
My father was doing different kind of technology development from the 70s and 80s. And then in the 90s, he started to do some of the first websites in Latin America, I guess. He ended up doing probably the first e-commerce company website in Mexico in 99, 2000. And then like many other interesting things on the internet.
That's really cool. So you've been on the front lines of tech ever since you sort of grew up.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I was trying to help and learn, and I was just curious. And my father was really passionate about programming. I started to code like when I was really, really early, very young. And I loved it. I definitely, I feel very lucky that I was able to find something that is so important today that I'm kind of good at, but it's also really passionate for me, which is programming. So I started doing my first website with just HTML, maybe 99, 2000 also. Ended up using open source technology to create an online forum in 2000, 2001. And that forum ended up growing to have millions of visits per year in those early days of the internet. And it was running in a server that was in my closet.
What was the forum about, and how old were you when you launched that?
I think I was 12 or 13. It ended up becoming bigger when I was 15 and 16. Originally, the forum was we were learning to play guitar, and we had all these tabs, which is these text files that have the songs. And sometimes they were not correct, but the websites where we usually found them didn't have a comment section. So the reason I found this open source project to be able to host online bulletin boards was because we wanted to be able to comment on those tabs for the guitar. And then people started to tell me hey, you should have another section for concerts and some other music related discussions. And very funny, I always look back at that moment and I'm wow, that was really smart. I don't know where it came from. But I was kind of lazy and I wanted this to grow more than I could invest time into doing. And the way that I ended up finding that was every time that people said oh, you should have a section for this thing or that thing, what I would do was just tell them to do it themselves. So I would ask them to be moderators of that new section and ask them to generate a lot of content that we could use for the first 30 to 90 days, find ways that they would do marketing to bring new users, find interesting people that we could have an ask me anything kind of thing. And they ended up kind of being volunteers, but really bringing a lot of community to the website. When I was 15, 16, we had 20, 30 different sections.
Wow. And was that all in Spanish or was that in multiple languages or?
That was all in Spanish, yeah.
And were most of your people that were reading it, were they from Mexico or from all over Latin America?
I would say most of them were from Mexico. We actually did a national convention. And there were people from 20 of the 32 states from Mexico. And this was a very different internet, right? This was when people wouldn't put their address or their name. It was mostly nicknames. You didn't know, you saw a nickname, you didn't know if it was male or female, if it was a 15-year-old or a 40-year-old or so it was very interesting that when most people came to that gathering that we did, I was one of the youngest people in the room.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's cool. So did they, when they went to this conference and they saw that you were a young kid, what was their reaction? Did they realize that from the start or were they shocked?
I think there was some people that kind of had interacted more with me and they had an idea that I was very young, but there were certainly other people who were very shocked. So it was a mix of reactions. It was fun.
Yeah, that's really cool. So you've been doing tech stuff because of your family and then starting, would you consider this a business or was it just a fun project?
We did try to monetize it, but most of the money that we got from different ads and other things, we put it down to hosting and other marketing swag that we could use to bring more people in. I kind of look back and regret not having tried to do it more like a business because maybe I would have learned a little bit more on that side. But it was certainly interesting. I'll give you an example of something really interesting from that moment. I didn't know that you could have different instances of your code running, in your computer so that you can develop and then on the website so you can have production. So what I would do is I would go to sleep kind of early and then wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning and work directly on the server doing changes that I require, to continue growing the site and have better usability or anything else. And I would start the night backing up all the files and doing some changes. And then if by 5 or 6 a.m. that I had to kind of go back to sleep, I hadn't finished, then I would just put back the original files. So if anyone was trying to access the website during that time, they would usually find the work that I was doing or, errors.
Wow. That's really interesting. So what happened to that site?
It was kind of weird. I mean, we had really like a very big community and we had great content generation. And we saw the opposite side of the wave, I think. We had spoken with some brands about sponsoring us because we had a lot of traffic on the internet, but this was very new for them. And they mentioned how much they paid for a sponsorship on magazines. And we were like, oh, that's a lot of money. But then when they came and offered different things to us, it was very, very small. So we were kind of like backwards in the sense that we thought like, oh, it's going to be like we should have a magazine. Like that would be a great idea. So we ended up taking a lot of the like moderators to curate some of the best content from the different sections. And then we spent like 4 months doing the first 6 episodes of this magazine and trying to get these sponsors to pay us. And it worked a little bit. It was not perfect. It was like a learning for us. But then when we came back to the website, the community was kind of dying a little bit because there was like, we removed the engine, of growth and engagement. And then we tried to do it again, but everyone was like tired and other things. So there are some different communities that moved to have their own like specialized community somewhere. And I was kind of tired at that moment. So we ended up just letting it die.
Yeah, those online communities are really, really fickle. They can move from one thing to the other really fast.
The strongest asset that you have, you cannot like distract yourself for a couple of months out of it.
Yeah, and back in 2000 and must have been like 2006, I was in my first company. We had just started a marketplace at our university, at University of Wisconsin. And to expand, we looked at universities that had forums that were, this was pre-Facebook being everywhere, and forums that had lots and lots of traffic. And we ended up buying forums at 3 other universities that had huge, huge, huge traffic. And it was amazing to see the fickleness of the people. Even in one case where we didn't change a thing, just the fact that there was an announcement that someone else was the owner of it, people really didn't like that.
Yeah.
And so what'd you do next?
After that, I spent a whole bunch of time working on different projects. So that was the time I was going through high school and then to college. What I did was I was doing a lot of freelancing and trying to find interesting projects to work on at the same time that I was learning more about programming. So I ended up working with a lot of brands. And I would say that I became a little bit like known for not only me, but a group of friends for being able to rescue projects. So if they had like this very big announcement that they were doing, they had like a website that they wanted to launch. Sometimes people had been working for months or weeks with an external team or an internal team, and they wanted to release this, but like they would miss the deadline. So a couple of weeks before the deadline, they would call us and be like, hey, we have this thing. We don't know if they're going to be able to finish or not. Or they just told us that they don't know how to do X or Y. And we would take the project and in a week we would finish it. And we were very expensive because it was like a SWAT team coming into this project that was already doomed to fail. And it was really fun because like it was easy to get a lot of money in very little time. But then at the same time, it was like 5 or 10 days of not sleeping a lot.
What did it feel like being a high school or college student and coming in and fixing these projects?
It was very weird. I mean, it was very similar to that experience being like a young person in that other experience on the forum, where you had people who maybe had been working on technology or systems, like technology systems for a long time, but they had never really done anything on the internet. And on the other hand, we had been doing like web development for a while. So we would come in and be like, oh, you're not doing this, you're not doing this. All this part of the code, it's useless. We can just replace it with a library. I think it was like a moment where we were already using frameworks and source control and open source tools, and a lot of other people, they were trying to build everything from zero. So, and they would get stuck on the really complicated things that usually we didn't even use, right? So we were usually just looking at what they were trying to do, and it's like, wow, like you guys are stuck building this thing that is already available as a library.
Got it. They just weren't really understanding the sort of the new rules to building tech.
Yeah. And, like it was that moment where people started to ask about like source control, and you have like CSV, I remember this older, like before Git, and we were using Git, and it was like a totally different experience. And there was like all these different things that we kind of knew how to do. So it was easy for us to do it.
And how long did you work on that project or with that company?
No, that was just like freelancing. That was just us finding companies that had these very specific use cases. Like there's a word of mouth of people who are like, hey, I have this project, it's about to fail. Do you know anyone? Do you know anyone? And I think we're one of the very few groups that were doing that. And whenever we heard of these projects, we would instantly like invite the other people in our community to help. So it was like, hey, I have this project. Do you want to help us in the next 5 days? And we just do it.
What were you studying at school at the time?
So I decided to not go to computer science because I saw the summary like of the different semesters and the syllabus, and I was like, I know already most of these things, like intro to programming. So what I wanted to do was to learn something new and then be able to take some of the later stages of computer science. So I ended up going to mechanics and electronics, which in Mexico there's like mechatronics, and it's kind of like these two different sides of engineering. And then all the classes that I could pick, I picked the later stage, like computer science ones. So it was like a mix of everything.
That's smart. I was going to say, yeah, you probably, since you've been programming since you were, 12, you probably knew more than even probably some of your professors at that point.
Yeah, there was some of those cases. Yep.
And, Latin America is generally a pretty credential heavy place where people really want to see the credential before they'll let you work on something. How were you able to get in and do projects while you still were in school? Was it just because the projects were failing and they had no one left to turn to?
I think so. And we did have like this very long list of things that we had worked before. Some of them, like this forum that I mentioned, but we had also built like other smaller things for ourselves. So it was easy to send them like a presentation, just like a deck, saying like, hey, we've done these things from zero. We've maintained this other thing, these other communities, and we've helped with these companies. So that way it was easy. And the other thing that was really important is that we were never on site. We might have like a couple of meetings with the decision makers, but we were always working from remotely. I did have other experiences later on in some companies in Latin America where like the culture that we had, where we were having post-its on the wall and kind of like very loud discussions about like specific topic in the like lunch space or whatever, didn't fit with like the usual like corporate part. So there was some crash in the culture. But at that stage, that was like a different situation. Here, I was able to do most of these like from our own houses.
What advice would you give to either entrepreneurs or engineers that maybe are either still in school or ended up not going the university route to be able to break into either getting a job or freelancing, kind of like what you did?
I think that building your own portfolio, either by doing small projects with other people or just like things for yourself, is going to definitely help. The second thing, and I guess this applies to all entrepreneurs doing anything, is that you have to believe in yourself. So you have to send those emails and you have to reply and follow up and follow through. So if you have an opportunity, you should definitely try to like reply to it and make sure that you are on top of it. Other than that, I think that what's really important is that you build your own knowledge base, right? Because a lot of these things we're able to do them because we not only believe in ourselves to have that meeting and just go in and say like, hey, we can do this, but there was also a lot of like, I actually know how to do that. It's like, I'm not making it up. So that kind of helps a lot on your confidence.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think especially maybe not so much in Mexico, but at least in Chile and Colombia, we've seen a lot of people that maybe just don't have that confidence when they probably should, because they are self-taught and they've done a bunch of different things before and sort of need to reach out and actually say, yeah, I can do this.
Yeah. On the university side, I mean, there were a lot of jokes inside of the family and with some friends while I was going through college that all of them were like gambling when I was going to drop out. Because I had always been like really doing all these projects and I kind of like wanted to do more, right? But my father was like, you should definitely try to finish like university and get your degree. You never know how it's going to be useful. And there might be some job opportunities or there might be other situations where it's going to be helpful. And I know things will change. And I know like there's more and more people who are self-taught. And honestly, a lot of what I do right now and before, most of it comes from reading and going to meetups and hackathons and meeting people and sharing and always being like trying to learn the next thing. But I did have a lot of interesting situations where I was able to get like a visa in the US to work for a startup over there that I would not have been able to have if I didn't have the degree. And I know there are people who didn't go to university or dropped out, and because of like specifically visas, they've had their job and their professional tracks kind of like different, and they've had to miss some opportunities just because they didn't have that. So even though it might not be required for like a specific job or for the knowledge, I would definitely suggest people that in this international world that you might want to move to different places and be able to do other things. A visa is going to be really useful, and most of them do still require and will require for a while that you have a degree.
Yeah, that's a really important one. I hadn't thought of the visa part for getting a degree. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, like I worked for a year in a startup in Monterey, and that was an amazing opportunity for me to get connected with the people in Silicon Valley and learn a lot of how things are done over there. And the type of visa that I used was not available if I didn't have the degree.
And how were you able to get connected up to Mountain View and get a job with a startup?
So, I mean, that connection comes from, again, my father. I think I was very lucky to kind of be part of this family. So my father, after doing a couple of companies here, and some of them have like a small amount of success, but then ultimately failure, he wanted to also get connected to the Silicon Valley. So he ended up finding an opportunity where he started, with the support of the government, technology accelerator for Mexican companies to go to Silicon Valley. And he ran that for like 8 years. So at the very beginning of that process, I would spend most of my summers going and just helping him in whatever I could. So I ended up going for like 2 or 3 summers and meeting some people. So by the time I was about to finish university, I tried to do a startup here in Mexico for like a year at the same time that I was in college, and it was beautiful and crazy, and there's a lot of lessons learned there also. But then right when that failed, I ended up going over the summer to try to help my father in whatever I could and spend some time in the Bay Area. And I ended up meeting the founder of a company that was really interesting. They were doing serious games for market research and ideation. They already had all these games that you play in person that are extremely fun and very productive. And they wanted to bring this both to the iPad and online. So I ended up being like their first hire during the summer, worked with them for 3 months. And then after that, ended up coming back to Mexico to my last semester, work remotely. And then ultimately, when I graduated, they made me a full-time offer with that relocation piece.
And what was it like going from having worked mostly in Mexico previously to jumping to Silicon Valley?
It was really interesting. I mean, that definitely shaped a lot of what I ended up trying to bring to the startup ecosystem here in Latin America. Not only, like, there were 2 pieces of this. One, the opportunity to work with experienced founders who had done technology before, who understood a lot of the sales cycles, but they also knew a lot of how to structure like the day-to-day operations of a startup. So we had a daily stand-up. We had a very clear plan of what we were trying to do. There were like all the really good practices that you should follow when you're doing software development. And my role there was 100% as a developer, right? So I got to learn really how to build technology in a fast-moving startup. But then that was like 9 to 5. And then after 5, I moved to Mountain View right at the beginning of a community called the Hacker Dojo, which was a very big hacker space. So I ended up going from like 5 to 11 every day to the dojo and just hanging out with other people from other startups and trying to do smaller projects and trying to do some open source development and trying to understand new technologies and sharing a lot of new tools. So I got to see like these 2 very different experiences of like a team that is just, this is what we're doing. We have a clear plan forward and you're trying to get to market, and then spend a couple of hours also every day saying like, hey, let's do this like 5-hour prototype and try to get someone to use it. So it was really fun. It was like, I look back at those days and I just smile. It was really fun.
And can you contrast that experience with, you said you had tried to start another startup when you were in school. What was the difference?
So the startup we tried to start here in Mexico, it was inside of another company. They were reselling technologies from Microsoft and SAP and other things. And they had this cash flow that looked really healthy, but they knew that ultimately it was going to get tougher to continue in that business. So they wanted to invest in innovation and they wanted to do their own projects. So in a way, what I was doing there we tried to set up like a very clear goal to do a social network. And again, this was 2007, so it sounds like a little bit different. But we're trying to do a social network for like professionals in Latin America. This was before LinkedIn had massive adoption here in Mexico. And we wanted and the idea originally was to have like a 3-year scope where the first 2 years it was like building product and getting the early community to be active, which was very similar to what I was doing before at the online forum, but with a very different kind of target, right? And then the idea was that on year 3 we'd try to monetize, and then because things happened differently, the cash flow ended up going down faster than they expected, and they tried to monetize like earlier in that process, and it was very tough because we didn't have enough traction to really get to anywhere that sounded interesting for them. So we ended up just not being able to meet the expectations, and ultimately everyone it didn't work out, right?
What would you say was the number 1 or 2 lessons learned from that experience?
So I think that, like, going back to the contrasting piece of it, I think that what we were lacking was an idea of how to do this, right? So we were trying to figure out everything. We didn't know how to structure the company. We didn't know how to set up the incentives. We didn't know how to budget and for how long. And we didn't know where to like optimize and say like, hey, maybe you don't need to build all of these things, but if you get this very specific feature, then we can test this other thing, right? And then in Silicon Valley, I felt the opposite. The people I was working with, they knew what they were doing. They had a very clear target of where to optimize, where not to optimize, where to spend more time. And that way we ended up being, like, I was able to learn their methodology. So when we ultimately started the first fund in 2011, the only thing I was trying to do was to try that methodology in more startups.
And so what year was it that you were working on the startup in the Valley?
That was 2010, 2011. And at the same time is that we ended up, like, I left that job to start the fund.
Got it. So did you always want to get into the investing side, or was that something that just came up?
No, not at all. I had never imagined myself doing that. So while I was doing the startup in Mexico, I had started a hacker community here. And then I moved to the Bay Area and I was helping that same hacker community, which they were the ones that started the Hacker Dojo. So at some point in 2011, we started to talk like, hey, we have this very healthy community of hackathons in Mexico. And there's like hundreds of people every couple of months going to our hackathons in 16 different cities. And all of them have the skills and everything required to do something like the things that I was seeing in Silicon Valley. And there was like different people in that community that started to ask the question like, hey, well, what's the next step for this community? How can we get more of these people doing full-time startups? And constantly we ended up like saying like, oh, well, the challenge is that there's no funding. So until someone fixes that, then like nothing's going to happen. Until like suddenly we ended up coming with the idea that no one was going to fix it for us in the way that we wanted. So either we did it ourselves, so we kind of like stopped hoping that someone else would do it. So in 2011, we ended up starting first like a small meetup in Palo Alto, where we would meet with some other Mexicans in the region and some people who knew the community from Mexico, but that they were more from the startup side and the hacker side in the US, to just talk about how a Mexican VC would be structured, if it made sense or not. And then a couple of months later, we just ended up, like, I ended up quitting my job, and two other people did the same. And we ended up creating this entity called Mexican VC, where we raised enough capital to invest in 7 companies. And the rest is history from there. Like, it's been 6 years of being on the other side of that table.
And you talked about figuring out what a Mexican VC would look like. What were some of the differences in the structure, if any, from what would a normal sort of Silicon Valley investor be structured as for doing the Mexico version?
So I think that it's not only the Mexico version, but I think it was more like understanding which stage we should be like focusing first. So we ended up being structured in the same way as a US fund would be structured. That entity is actually an LP in Delaware that invested mostly in Delaware C Corps. So in a matter of sense, like in the entity side or the structure side, what we ended up deciding was that there was not enough track record of the Mexican entities and the potential like Mexican investment contracts to make sense to international investors. So the best way for us was to just try to do everything in the same way that the US was doing it, and then have subsidiaries to operate the companies. Other than that, I mean, everything else was just understanding what was a right ticket size. And I mentioned like we ended up going for $20,000, trying to understand what would be a good investment thesis and how do we bring the right people to be working on this. And the reality is that we were figuring out everything as we went, right? We opened an application process with a very rough idea of what the offering was to the startups. We ended up getting 70 projects to apply. We interviewed 15 of those, ended up picking 7. And with those 7, we ran an accelerator program that was really just like a 9-month-long hackathon in my department.
And what was the investment thesis when you first started in terms of, was there a type of company you liked? Was it a stage?
Yeah, I think that we're looking for people who had a product that had the technical skills, and that product that we were seeing and how they build it was like a very clear proof of that. And then we would help them get to market and ideally get next investors. That was a very rough thesis. We knew a lot of people who were good with technology. We thought that the market was good, but a lot of people were not brave enough to launch to the market just because they were doing that in their weekends, right? So we wanted to give money to people so that they could be doing this full time for at least 6 months. And in those 6 months, they could put this product to market, get first customers, and ideally be able to raise their next round. Originally, we thought that next round was going to be a small, $50,000 round where they could prove marketing, get unit economics, and then they would raise a seed round. And that's why I mentioned before that the way that we ended up evolving is we, after that, and I can talk a little bit more of how we joined 500 startups and how the thesis changed a little bit, but we try to give more money to the companies. Right now, we're doing 65,000. And the reality is that 65,000 is just the money that we know that they require to be full-time on this for at least 6 to 12 months. Most of them already have a little bit of a cash flow now, so that's a little bit easier. But then we're giving them that money so that they can experiment different growth tactics so that they have unit economics and they can raise a seed round. So in a way, we've stayed in the same, before the seed round stage. We've just tried to do everything before that stage.
And what was it like in that 9-month period working with 7 companies when you're just getting started? And you said from your apartment. So how did that go?
So something that was kind of surprising was that we were expecting most of these companies to come from Guadalajara, Mexico, and Monterrey, and very heavily in Mexico City, right? And that ended up being totally the other way around. We had, out of the 70 companies that applied, we had companies from 28 different states. We ended up picking just one company from Mexico. The rest were from Mexico City. The rest were from other places of Mexico. So the first thing that we had to do, and the reason, we didn't have a budget. We were just running this from our own savings and the money that we had raised to invest in the company. So we told them hey, we can do this through Skype, but ideally you should spend some time here in Mexico City. If you want, you can stay here. So we ended up having, I would say most of the teams would spend 1 to 2 weeks in Mexico City staying at the apartment. And then the rest of the time was through Skype. So it really was a crazy period where we were trying to do everything from this hackathon mentality of saying hey, we're going to wake up every day and ask ourselves hey, what are you doing today? What you did yesterday? Are you blocked with something? And then we're all going to try to help. So you would hear the stand-up from all the 7 companies. And every day there was something in the community that was useful, right? So someone would say oh, I don't know, I need someone who knows about this technology, or I'm trying to reach out to this particular type of client. And someone else from another company would be oh, I can help you with that. And in a way that was really smart for us. It was a little bit similar to the moderators in the forum. It was we want to provide as much value we can to these companies, but ideally, we also want this community to help each other. So we ended up baking that in the beginning with those stand-ups and other interactions like that. Other than that, it was really just very similar to working in one startup, just have different projects happening at the same time around you.
What are some of the things you learned during that process about investing or even companies in general?
Out of those 7 companies, to put a little bit of context, there's 5 now, 6 years later, that are dead. And then there's 2 that have raised more than $6 million in their Series A. Both of them have over 40, 50 people in their companies, and they are doing pretty well. So a lot of the learning happened in those 9 months, right? Just looking at what worked and what didn't work. But a lot of the other learning, and most on the investment side, also has to do with what actually worked and what didn't work. And I think that if I could point at something that is really crucial on the investing side, is that the teams that really were able to achieve the next stages and go to like now an interesting stage had founders that could walk through walls, right? Like they would definitely not stop because of like a simple problem. They usually were able to put different kind of emotions like ego or other things aside and really focus on solving the problem. So it's interesting that these two companies, they both have founders who are very strong. They don't listen to everyone. They have a clear plan, and once they have it, they set up to execute. So those are the kind of traits that I look in founding teams now. And like I think that we'll continue to understand how to measure that when you're just meeting a new team. But that's definitely one of the biggest lessons learned.
And how did you end up getting connected up with 500 startups and ending up joining them?
So the way that we had the first interaction with 500 startups is that they invested in that first fund that we did. And they were the first investors. So we got connected to the early founding kind of team at 500 startups when we were starting this because they were also starting. They were in their fund one in 2011. They had started in 2010. So I think that for them, it was a very cheap way to experiment with what an international expansion would look like if you were doing this through the microfund strategy, if you will, which is actually the way that 500 has evolved their international expansion. Now we have like 13 different microfunds. So that was a very, I think a very easy way for them to test how it would look like if you take some people who know about startups who are involved with a hacker community and help them start a fund, and how does that work and what are the challenges and other things. So when we ended up doing a demo day in the US, 500 invested in two of these companies. One of the ones that I mentioned is doing really well, and one of the ones that is dead. And then moments later, they also ended up investing in the other company, in the one that is also performing. So when we came back to raise more money to try to do this again, we're having a conversation with them, and they mentioned hey, you probably want to do this at least 10 times bigger so that you have enough management fees to kind of have an office and be able to pay for yourself, but also potentially a small team that can help the startups in different ways. So they kind of challenge us and say hey, do a plan for how do you do this 10 times bigger, and then we might consider doing it together. And that conversation ended up evolving in also starting a new fund, which was 500 Luchadores 1. We ended up raising $3.2 million in that fund and invested in 79 companies from 2012 to 2015.
So that's a lot of companies for 79 companies. And
10 times bigger.
Yeah, exactly. And how was that scaling from 7 to 79?
So I wouldn't say that there was a lot of a change. I mean, we went from 7 companies in one batch to 10 companies in the next one, and then 15 in the next one. The biggest change, I think, was that at the beginning, we're talking with the 500 startups team. They mentioned hey, you probably want to consider not only Mexico, but the whole Spanish-speaking Latin America. So we opened the application to everyone, and we started to get a lot of companies from Argentina, some companies from Chile and Colombia. And that helped a lot because if you grow, you have a broader scope and you're still picking the ones that make more sense to you, you end up usually with better quality. But then once people move to the accelerator for the time that they were going to be with us, you would see a little bit more competition just coming from different, there's a dynamic, very interesting dynamic when you have people from different contexts. That is both there's some interesting situations people suddenly having a new network of just contacts in another country or different ways to look at different industries. So it was really interesting. I think that was definitely key to building what we've done so far.
Yeah, I think that's one of the sort of underrated pieces of Latin American startup culture is that there's so much intermixing between all of the different countries because aside from Brazil and a little bit in Mexico, the markets are small. So you have to quickly go across other countries if you're targeting the Latin American market. So we've seen this similar thing where of our portfolio, there's founders from 9 countries. I think there's employees from 13 or 15, and you just get a big mix. And that network between the other countries is really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, we continue to do the community side a lot. And now we have founders who have expanded to other countries thanks to that network. a lot of different contacts. We have investors who have like started investing more in another region just because they met someone from the accelerator.
It's cool to see how the ecosystem has grown. And so how many companies were in the last cohort of companies that you invested in?
So we did 79 companies from 2012 to 2015. And then last year we started a new fund and we're investing from that fund. So that fund has done 2 batches. The first one we graduated late last year, and then we just finished another one, which was the batch 7. And that one had 15 companies.
And so you are investing when they go through the program. Do you do any follow-on investing as well in the top companies?
We do. We don't do a lot. And the reason for that is, first, we would need to have a very, very big fund if we wanted to do follow-on investments in all the good companies. Just because at least 1/3 of the companies that are coming out are companies that I would love to do follow-on investments. And it also puts us in a weird situation with like co-investors and other entities that want to invest after us. There's a lot of signaling if we invest in companies right after the accelerator. So what we've done so far is that we do follow-on investment in some companies. We're usually trying not to do it close to demo day. So either we do it before demo day or way after demo day. And we do it always from the global fund. So out of the, I would say maybe like $5 million we've deployed from the regional vehicles, we've done another $4 million in follow-on investment from the global fund. And still, it feels like it's very little.
Let's talk about a little bit the Mexican ecosystem. You know, there's lots of companies that you'd like to invest in. You're getting probably lots of applications from Mexico plus the region. What have you seen change since you've been involved in the ecosystem, either back in university or even just since you started investing?
I think there's been a lot of different changes, and we can maybe talk about some of them. So the first one is that we've seen startups and entrepreneurs become more sophisticated. So at the beginning, we received only companies that had an early prototype. Now it's very common for us when we're doing interviews. Most, if not all, of the companies have a product in the market, and they're doing already sales of like, I don't know, $500 to $5,000 per month. So that has been a big change, right? That people are more sophisticated and they apply to us having done more. A trend that is just starting, and I'm imagining it's only going to get stronger, is that a lot of people that are coming to us already having previous investors, which didn't happen at all a year or 2 years ago. Now they're starting like, oh yeah, my uncle invested $20,000 or something like that. Or these other angel investors from my city invested $50,000. And of course you can see the results of having like invested that money in the company. So it's good for us and it's good for the company, and hopefully it will be good for the angel investors. In terms of technology and what they are doing, I think there's always been like a very big like topic of people saying like, oh, there's not a lot of innovation. There's a lot of copycats, and they're just trying to do like solve or repeat whatever worked in another region. And I've always seen that as a false kind of argument. I think that people see similar problems everywhere in the world, and they see similar solutions, but the context makes it very unique. So we do have companies that are doing something like Square, but in Mexico, something like Stripe, but in Mexico. We've done like some food delivery that are similar to other ones. But the reality is that culture is so different that I think in the very like specific details of how they're building their solution, it ends up being a very different challenge for them. And I always try to exemplify this with like, if you were trying Square in like one of the hacker meetups or something like that in a hacker space, people will be like, oh, how are you doing this? But if you try that outside of the subway here in Mexico City, people are going to think that you're cloning their car, right? That's the challenge that you have to face when you're doing something like Square here in Mexico or in any place of Latin America. So I think that is changing a little bit in the way that people are starting to like stop talking about copycats, and they're like more just like doing general startups. The other thing that I think has changed, and maybe I can think of other things, but this one I think is very interesting. At the beginning, we saw a lot of companies trying to do fintech, specifically payments and loans, and then a lot of other infrastructure related like logistics and transportation just for e-commerce. And now we're starting to see way more of other things, like everything else. And I think that was just like a wave of people like looking at, hey, similar to us looking at, oh, someone has to do like a fund. I guess like other people visualize, oh, someone has to do payments, right?
Yeah, I think that's right too, where most of the seemingly successful companies in the beginning in Latin America were fintech, some e-commerce, transport. And I think now that one, there's more sophistication, and two, there's more examples of companies from Latin America starting to have success either pan-LATAM wide or even just worldwide, globally, but operating from Latin America, I think is a good sign. It's pretty interesting to see how that's changed. So what are some of the most surprising things that either US entrepreneurs or investors would find if they come to a 500 startups demo day in Mexico City or in Monterrey?
I don't know. I mean, I guess if people have gone to our demo days in the US, they would find that they're a little bit more formal. We're trying to make them a little bit more casual and more fun. But it's generally a little bit like the investment is seen. It feels like a little bit more the old school business, and it's just changing to be a little bit more startup-like. Other than that, I think that they would feel like a normal demo day in other places. I don't know. I think that I don't know what would surprise people.
Talking about some of the sort of old school or business-like stuff, what's it like working with some of the other investors in Mexico that are maybe some are funds and some are family offices? What's it like?
I mean, there's a little bit of everything, some kind of context. Of the 130 companies that we've invested in, the top 20 that are doing the best have raised $104 million after us. And that money is coming from family offices, funds, from the region, from international funds, some institutionals. So we see a little bit of everything. There is definitely some really good people. I mean, there's players like that have been working for 5, 6, 7 years building like Fund 1, now on Fund 2 or even Fund 3. They are like top notch. They have experience with the industry. Some of them are coming from some companies like Mercado Libre in the case of Kasek, or some other experiences like that. But then you also find like people who are coming like from a very different industry. They're from private equity or from some kind of old industry, and they have money and they think that they can set the terms. Or there are some other family offices or other entities that sometimes have like different ways to think about startups. So they will propose either very different terms or structures or other things. So generally it's been really good working with the top people, and it's been a lot of like working with the other to try to understand that we're not just like trying to propose something because we think it's a good idea. Sometimes these are like battle tested tools like a convertible note or like setting some kind of vesting on stocks. Like the reason we're proposing to do it like this, not just because we think we're smart or anything like that, it's because like we've seen it work, right? So other than that, I think that the other very big thing is that there's still way more demand than supply on the capital like ecosystem. So you see like decision taking processes taking a long time. Like a Series A could take anywhere between like 6 to 12 months, even in a good, with traction, with the right contacts and everything. Like almost any round, any fundraising effort takes at least 6 months.
And that's because there's just not enough competition over the deals?
Well, I think competition over the deals is definitely one of the key factors that will bring that number to be a little bit lower. Right now, I think there is if you are on the investment side of a Series C or a Series A, you know no one else is going to pull the trigger in the next month. Then you can just wait and see if the strategy that you're proposing actually works as they say that it's going to work. So it's easy for investors to say like, oh, we love what you're doing, but we're not going to have investment committee this month, and next month we had already appointed this company. So why don't you come back in like 2 months and we'll prepare you for the meeting in 3 months. And you can give us an update if your numbers are still looking pretty well. And people end up entering at the same valuations like now or in 6 months. So I think that that's part of the factor.
So what advice would you give to founders in Latin America who are trying to raise money in this sort of ecosystem?
I mean, if you're pre-seed, my advice would be that you come to us and other entities like us. There's other really good players like Wida or NXTP. There's definitely some, like these institutions, like we build them because we want to avoid people wasting 6 months to raise $50,000, right? Now, if you're on the seed or Series A, my first and most important advice is to keep everyone posted. Like from the moment that you start working, start building that relationship, even if you're not actively pitching. just to make sure that they know who you are and know your numbers. So I recommend people like either once a month or every quarter to have like a CRM of potential investors and be like, hey, this is an update with numbers, with KPIs. These are our unit economics. We'll probably raise in X or whatever amount of months. So that when you actually start a fundraising process, you already have enough people in the pipeline that you can generate a little bit of that like fear of missing out a little bit, just so that, and that they know that you're talking with everyone else is going to make them feel that they have to be a little bit quicker.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And I noticed that companies that go through 500 definitely update me more than many of the other companies that have gone through other investors in the region. And I think it's really important because maybe you do see something that piques your interest based on the numbers that they're hitting, or even just the fact that they're continuing to stay in contact is a big leg up compared to many of the companies when you tell them, no, not interested right now, or they maybe have their first approach. They just don't talk to you for 6 months or a year.
No, absolutely. I mean, for us, when we are interviewing companies, it's very easy to see if they have applied before. And we see like where you were 6 months ago and like a year ago. And like maybe we've had companies apply 4 times before they come in. And if I see that, like that you were in the same place that you are right now 6 months ago, like it's an instant no for me. But if I see that they're like every time that I've had an update or you've applied again, I see like progress, I'm going to be inclined to, even if you don't have solved a specific problem that I might notice, I'm going to be inclined to want to interview with this company and want to know more just because I see progress.
Yeah, no, that makes good sense. We have online application and can see the progress, compare the revenue numbers, compare the user numbers. And it's not likely that someone will invest if you haven't made much progress in 6 months or a year. And so what advice would you give to yourself, knowing what you know today, going back to when you were just starting with Mexican VC?
Like there is very tactical advice, right? Like I would certainly have tried to understand that doing a fund is a financial vehicle for LPs. So I would have doubled down on investor relationships earlier, for sure. That's something that took me a long time to understand. And I mean, I was coming from trying to bring this solution for entrepreneurs in the region, right? So like I never really spent a lot of time in those early years understanding that the relationship with the investors was definitely a key piece of this. And now we're working really strong on that. Other like less tactical and more like human nature kind of thing would be that it really takes a long time. I mean, it's hard, like you have to administer and manage your expectations and your energy because it doesn't matter if you're doing a startup or a fund or like angel investing or ecosystem development. Any of these things are going to take 5 to 10 or 15 years. Like the first investments that we did in Mexican VC, we were extremely lucky to work with so like passionate entrepreneurs who are so capable and that they've been able to get to some really interesting stages. And like we haven't seen liquidity yet. We will see that potentially in 2 to 4 years. And we started 6 years ago. We were very lucky to invest in some really good companies in which I was one. And again, I think that we'll start to see liquidity, like the big like liquidity events, because we've had 3 exits so far. We're negotiating a 4th one. But still, like the big ones are going to come like after 2020. So you have to be in for the long run.
Yeah, that's definitely true, especially in Latin America, where things move a little bit slower. There's fewer acquisitions. So yeah, I think having that long-term view is really, really important.
And you want to make sure that you have those expectations and you can manage your energy accordingly. But you also have to set those expectations to your investors, to the entrepreneurs who are in your network, to the corporates who are trying to help you, to the government. Like I think that there's a lot, and I see like even more now, people who have like this very wishful thinking that this new program or this other thing is going to solve this problem in like 1 or 2 years. And I know that honestly, like we'll start to see the real effects of what we started to build in the hackathon we were doing in 2008, maybe in 10 years, right? So it's really like a slow shifting thing to change a whole ecosystem.
And talking about changing the ecosystem, what would be 1 or 2 changes that you would recommend either to governments, it could be Mexico or just another Latin American country, to make entrepreneurship better and make themselves more entrepreneurial friendly, and to local investment firms to help move the ecosystem forward?
I mean, for the governments, I think that there's a lot that they can do trying to really support the efforts of people who have already started doing things, that there's a lot of like material effort on that, on moving things forward, and try to do less of the really noisy and beautiful, but sometimes really fussy, like ecosystem development projects that sometimes they do. I see a lot of times like a lot of money being spent either on events or marketing or just these like competitions in different ways that a lot of times are not aligned with making startups successful, right? So I would certainly try to bring more entrepreneurs and more people to work closer to them to know what they need, right? So I see a lot of governments doing like these kind of like idea or like other kind of like competitions where at the end they'll give you like some kind of prize, and then the whole ecosystem rallies to that when and suddenly you see that there's like 1 or 2 or 3 years of effort where no one launched that project to the market, when people were not like inclined to optimize to solve something for a client or customer. So I would certainly try to optimize for that. On the investment professionals and other funds, I think that a lot of times I would try to suggest people in different stages to talk more with entrepreneurs to see what stages they are kind of having trouble with, and then build specific solutions for that. So, and my specific effort on this is that a lot of times I travel to other regions or some cities here in Mexico, and I hear some bigger like PE funds that are trying to do venture capital or some like angel group complaining that they don't have enough deal flow. And instead of like saying like, oh, maybe my ticket size should be different, or maybe I should help companies with like an earlier stage project, they just say like, oh, that's the reason I'm not active, why I reject most of the projects. So I think that anyone who's saying like, I don't have enough deal flow should try to change their offering, because there's enough deal flow for sure.
Yep, I agree with you completely. I mean, there's probably more of them are at the sort of pre-seed and seed stage rather than $2 million check size kind of Latin American Series A rounds. And we have that same sort of complaint that we see in Chile and in Colombia. But, you know, there's tons of companies that I would be happy to invest in at the pre-seed and seed stage that they should try to get in on too, because there's great companies coming out of it.
Absolutely. I mean, just like a very clear, concise way to put this, if we had 10 times more capital, we would do 10 times more investments. There is no, like, I have no questions about it, like the amount of potential investments that we see, that we should be saying yes instead of no. And we're capital constrained. And then suddenly hearing these other investors saying like, oh no, there's not enough good projects, or like most of the things that are pitching to them, and they say like they don't have like a validated business model or something like that. But a lot of times what they mean by that is that they would expect companies to be in a very different situation. Like some investors compare like, oh yeah, I want to invest in the startups, but they have to be something like Uber. It's like, well, if Uber came in the stages that you're seeing companies, you wouldn't have recognized it. So I don't know, like that's a little bit of a pet peeve that I have.
No, I think that's right. I mean, we see the exact same thing. There's, you know, we're also capital constrained, and we happily invest in at least 5x and probably 10x more companies if we had the capital to do it, that probably should be getting money from somebody. So what's next for 500 in Mexico and for you?
We're launching the next application process this Monday, and we'll receive roughly like 1,000 applications. We'll boil that down to 15 to 20 in the next 100 days. We're starting back batch 8 in November 1st. So, and we'll repeat that 2 more times in 2018. And then 2019 will be the year where we have to decide what's really the next step for us. If we are doing bigger fund to do follow-ons or open more of these in other locations in Latin America, or like change something in our model. Like I think right now we're pretty locked down with this strategy, at least for 1.5 years. And that's great. I think we'll probably have seen at that moment a little bit more of the bigger liquidity events and follow-on rounds. So that's going to help a lot on designing that strategy. I mean, it's just doing more of what we have this incredible fortune to have the possibility to be doing here in Latin America.
Yeah, and you guys have been doing a great job pushing the ecosystem forward, and it's great to see the companies that you guys are helping and watching you push it forward, especially in Mexico. So hopefully we can continue to work together to make the ecosystems better and help Latin American entrepreneurs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you or anyone listening to this podcast is coming to Mexico City, feel free to reach out. We absolutely love to have people either come to some of the events we do here at the office or meet some of the startups and just generally connect with everything that is happening here.
And where can startups find more info about 500 in Mexico? And where can someone connect with you, either, Twitter or LinkedIn?
So, I mean, the easier thing to do would be to go to 500.co/LATAM. We have there the whole portfolio here. There's a newsletter if you want to be notified of different things. Either like there's one for entrepreneurs, there's another one for the whole investor education programs that we do. And then if people want to reach out to me, I guess like Twitter would be good. It's Defect, DFECT. Or maybe the easiest way just to have like a more insightful conversation is through email. So my email is santiago@500.co.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for taking the time to have this conversation with me. I enjoyed it. Hopefully we can meet up again in Mexico City sometime this year.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the invitation. It was super fun to be part of this podcast.
Awesome. Have a good rest of your day.
All right. Bye.
Thanks again for listening to Crossing Borders. Hope you enjoyed my conversation with Santiago from 500 Startups in Mexico. If you did, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and Stitcher. And if you have any comments, please shoot me an email via my website, nathanlustig.com. And as always, if you enjoyed what you saw, please give me a rating on iTunes and Stitcher. Thanks again.